Hola, buenas noches. Hello, everybody. Good evening. So glad you could join me. I know this is not our typical time to go live, but it's when things worked out for today. But for those of you here live, I appreciate you being here. Welcome everybody who might be new. My name is Adelia Aborshade, although most people know me as Picky Girl Travels the World. I have been traveling the world. That's a good question for how long? I don't know. Since 2013, 2010, I can't remember. But on this channel, I talk about my adventures as a solo traveler. I talk about what my life is like living abroad. I have lived outside of my home country for almost 9 years. Next month will make 9 years. And we also talk about money and its role in helping us live the life that we want. I am a financial educator by day, a YouTuber by night. And so if you're new here, welcome. If any of those topics are of interest to you, definitely you should be subscribed to the channel. That way, YouTube knows what kind of content you like and will make sure that more of my stuff actually makes it to your feed. So, uh, given kind of some things that have been going on, I thought it might be nice to have a conversation about, accessing healthcare abroad, answering some of your questions. I know that we've talked about how there has been a large influx in the number of people who are really considering moving abroad. Most of the people who watch this channel live in the United States. So that's primarily who this video is for. And with so many people in the US now, like really giving it some thought about leaving and moving somewhere else, inevitably, healthcare, medical care, that comes up. Um, you know, Often, particularly for those of us who are from the United States, medical expenses, healthcare are often seen as sort of an impediment, a barrier to moving abroad. Um, and we've got to realize and own that that's partially because the United States leads the rest of the world in healthcare costs. So if you're living in the United States, you are paying more for healthcare than everybody else in the world. So I can get why you might be concerned that, like, how am I going to handle these costs? I can barely handle them now. Also, um, the US is one of the few places in the world that ties your access to health insurance to your job. In most places, that's a very, very foreign concept. And so if we kind of move past those two things, we can have a conversation about, what does medical care look like in other countries, and will it be accessible, and am I going to have to worry about how much it costs and that sort of thing. So if you're here tonight and you have some questions, drop those in the chat. We'll see if we can get you some answers. If you happen to be watching this on the replay, you are free to drop your questions in the chat, in the comments, and I'll do my best to get you some answers. Um, I I think about to when I moved abroad. I might be the oddball here, but medical care was not, healthcare was not at the top of my list when I was, you know, weighing, should I move to this country? Should I not move to this country? Um, like I don't know. It just wasn't a very big concern for me, but I know for a lot of us it is. And Stephanie Perry has said this many a time, but I think it deserves repeating. healthcare is actually a reason to leave the United States and not a reason to stay. Because one of the things I've discovered, and if you talk to anybody who has lived outside the US for any length of time, they'll tell you that the healthcare is more accessible to them outside the US and costs them less. Um, and I know that's often hard for folks from the US to wrap their head around because, we've been fed this idea that the United States is the greatest place in the world. Everybody wants to be us. We're the best in the game. How true that is, we're not here to talk about that tonight. But if that's what we've been fed, I get why we're a little suspicious about other places. I think most people's concerns revolve around three things. That is cost, quality, and availability. So let's talk about those concerns. Are those valid concerns? Um, I think they can be. I think we can't paint the rest of the world outside the United States, with a broad brush and say, this is what healthcare is like elsewhere, other than saying it's going to be cheaper. I think a lot of it depends on where you are going. And so if you're not like me and healthcare is very high on your list as you are making these considerations, um, let's talk about how that figures into you deciding if this is a place that works for you, if this is a place that doesn't. Um, like I said, cost, quality, availability. And I want to address something that I see more often than I think I should. There are folks who will talk about, I'm not sure how they're doing their research, but they will often bring up Cuba as a great place for medical care. And if you are looking at the number of doctors per person, per capita, per 100 people in Cuba, nobody can touch them. Cuba has more doctors. That little bitty island country has more doctors than everybody else. But there's a lot of medical knowledge and innovation happening on the island. However, they don't have the infrastructure to respond to medical emergencies in a way that you would probably be comfortable with. They don't have the medical supplies. I mentioned this in the videos that I posted about my last trip to Cuba. I went in 2022, 2023, somewhere around there. And the fact that when you come to Cuba, particularly as a US American, you have to give a reason. And there's only 12 approved reasons that you can visit. And a lot of us choose, aid to the Cuban people. And that aid often was in the form of bringing medical supplies. And they run the whole gamut, adult diapers, IV tubes, various medications. Like, there is such a lack of resources. There's tons of knowledge, there are tons of skilled practitioners, but the infrastructure is not there, nor are the actual resources. So I mention this because it's important when you are weighing, does this country measure up in terms of healthcare to what I need? It's important to consider things like infrastructure. Um, the vast majority of places, with the exception of Cuba, you can kind of, well, I don't know if Cuba's the exception here, but the vast majority of places that you can be considering moving to, if you look at the infrastructure and like the number of hospitals, the number of trauma centers, what are there, are are there roads? Are there paved roads? Because not all countries got that many of them. Like, weighing those things can give you some insight as into what what's possible there, what exists. Um, and I think we also need to think about, you know, um, the difference between emergency medical care, preventative medical care, and elective medical care. Because we often just talk about, well, or we ask, what is healthcare like in that country, without getting specific as to what is our concern. Do you have a chronic medical condition that you need to have access to specific therapies, specific medications? Or are you looking to get a BBL and you want to know about those kinds of medical things? Or are you concerned about emergency responses? Because those things are all different and separate, and a country can excel in one and not do so great in the other. Um, Sweet Lotus Beauty, I only care about affordability, and many countries' healthcare is accessible and affordable. Um, okay, that's valid. I know, being in the United States, I was very acutely aware that I was only one medical emergency away from financial ruin, and that's most people. Um, and the idea that, like, we don't even know, even if we have insurance, we don't know what things will cost us, and they could be astronomically high. So I get why that might be at the top of your list. One bit of financial advice I've gotten is to save and invest your HSA. It's really hard to do in the US because of the crazy cost of healthcare. Um, Definitely a higher priority. I will remind everybody who is thinking about an HSA, you're only eligible for a health savings account, an HSA, if you have a high deductible insurance plan. If your plan is not indicated as being a high deductible plan, you are not eligible for that. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. So, okay. Um, let's talk about cost. Um, In a lot of places, in a lot of countries, there is going to be a public system that is probably going to be the most affordable, but there will be trade-offs about, like, wait times and access and that sort of thing, versus a private system where you probably will pay more than you do for the public, but you might have greater access, shorter wait times, things like that. We could be talking about the difference between, having a shared room and a private room if you go to a private system, things like that. Something else that I think is really hard for US Americans to wrap their head around is we are very locked into this idea that we need to have health insurance. And because if you don't have health insurance, you're low key screwed in the US, right? So we're very locked into this idea. Well, what am I going to do for health insurance? And um, health insurance doesn't quite work the same way outside the US as it does in the US. I have worked in 3 different countries where my employer provided medical insurance, and in those 3 countries, my medical insurance really leaned more toward the side of being for catastrophic things. It In the US, we expect our medical insurance to cover preventative care. We expect it to cover, like, I go to the doctor and I have a checkup. That should be covered by my insurance. I shouldn't have to pay out of pocket for that. In my experience, That's not been the case while I've been working abroad. The insurance was really intended to cover hospitalizations, accidents, um, like cancer, paying for pregnancy care and delivery, those like the big ticket items. Going to the doctor was not seen as something that should be covered by your insurance, and typically has been at a price point that you can pay out of pocket. I'll use the country that I live in now, Mexico, as an example. Somebody was talking about, like, I care about affordability. Let's dig into it a little bit, what that word affordability means, because affordability to me, someone who lives in Mexico and primarily earns dollars, is different than affordability for somebody who primarily earns pesos. And at one point, I did earn pesos in Mexico, and what I would have considered affordable then versus what I consider affordable now, very different things. Um, but here in Mexico, if you're not feeling good and you need to go to a doctor and figure it out, there is the whole gamut when we talk about price points. A lot of the pharmacies have little doctor's offices next door to them, and you can see a doctor so that you can get a diagnosis for, what is the equivalent to less than $5 USD, or you can book directly with a doctor, and then there's a whole range of doctors. I've had a doctor come to my house to check me out and diagnose me, and that was the equivalent of $75 USD. And this is me texting the doctor and saying, "Hey, I'm not feeling good. Can you come over and check me out?" So affordability can be a whole range. Now, what would you pay to have a doctor diagnose you without insurance in the United States? I would imagine that would be a few $100. And I can tell you this, another difference is outside of the US, they will tell you what it will cost because of the US system and the interconnectedness with the insurance companies. It's often difficult to know how much something is going to cost you even when you have insurance. Um, but here, like, I could ask straight up, like, how much do you charge? How much will this cost? At the doctor's office, the consultorios, they will have listed how much it costs to talk to the doctors. So you can have access to a doctor without needing um, specific insurance, and also having needing to go through the whole referral process. If you wake up and you feel like, oh, this is a gastrointestinal issue, you can directly contact that kind of doctor, find out what their fee is, and pay them. So, insurance, I think when you're abroad, you need to think about insurance differently. And also, I would say access. I very much feel like I have way more control about and say um, about, like, which doctors I go to and that sort of thing, or if I need to go to this doctor versus that doctor, than I did when I was in the US. But I do have uh, a medical insurance policy that I got on my own, that was not issued through an employer. Um, and as a resident of this country, as a resident of Kuwait, as a resident in China and in Honduras, I was able to get insurance there, and, like, to cover those things. If you are somebody who your time abroad is not going to be spent in any one specific country, and you don't want to be surprised, well, I'm not gonna say surprised, but if you are concerned about, like, if I have to go to the hospital, if I have to be admitted, if I have an accident, what is that going to cost me? You need to explore getting a travel medical insurance policy. That's different than travel insurance. If you are somebody who is living in a specific country for a specific amount of time, a travel policy is probably not going to work for you because it's intended to cover you on various trips. If you've been in that country for 8 months, the insurance company may not see you as a traveler, they may see you as a resident. And of course, a travel medical insurance policy is different than travel insurance. Travel insurance is about your trip. Did they lose your luggage? Was your flight delayed? Did that cause a disruption in your trip? That sort of thing. But like, I need to have access to medical care while I am traveling the world. That's a separate kind of policy. Um, so we're talking about costs. Um, the other two things that people are concerned about, quality and availability. A lot of folks uh, are concerned about, like, well, are the doctors as good as the doctors I have in the US? If they've been to, like, a medical school, I hate to say, like, "Oh, there's so many doctors here in Mexico that trained in the US," because I think we're all being reminded that the US, particularly when it comes to science and medicine and research, is not necessarily, the bar everybody is striving for, because, our country has really made a push toward, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, anti-science and things like that. But, uh, doctors everywhere have to go to medical school and have to have credentials and that sort of thing. So, um, unless you are considering moving to some area that is, incredibly rural and isolated and maybe doesn't have access to many doctors, the fact that a doctor earned their degree outside of the US doesn't make their degree any less valid, if you get what I'm saying there. So, you can, if it makes you feel better, you can research the specific country that you are considering and find out, like, what does it take to become a doctor there? What, do they have to do residencies and all of that sort of thing? I guarantee you they probably do. And then the issue of availability. I think for the folks who envision kind of like a life off the grid, a life in some kind of rural place, that's where you really have to ask yourself, like, availability, as well as that this goes back to infrastructure. If you want to live in a very rural place, there's probably not going to be large hospitals and trauma centers and things like that. Are you going, like, something to consider is, how long will it take you to reach a hospital to receive emergency care? Because again, as I said before, emergency care is different than preventative care. The vast majority of places that you are probably considering moving abroad to, getting quality preventative care is probably very easy, very affordable. Um, where things get a little tricky is emergency response and emergency care. And I will admit, being somebody who lived in the United States for 41 years, there were certain things that I had expectations about, like, if you have an emergency, you call 911, they send a ambulance with paramedics. That is not always the case. This is something that when you're online and you're doing your research for the specific country that you're into, this is something to ask about. I will again use Mexico City as an example. I used to live across the street from a fire station. And I assumed, because in the US, fire stations have ambulances and they have paramedics. I assumed the fire station I lived across here in Mexico City had an ambulance. It did not. Turns out that for the 9 million people in the boundaries of Mexico City, there are only 45 ambulances run by the city. Are there more ambulances than that? Yes. Many of them are private. There are private ambulance services, but like the idea that they all have a paramedic on board and there's a minimum standard of care that you're going to receive, that is not the case here. And so does that mean I shouldn't live in Mexico City because there are only 45 ambulances? I don't think so. But what that does mean is knowing that I need to have a plan for, okay, if I need to get to a hospital in an emergency situation, do I have the number of a private ambulance company? Does my insurance work with a specific ambulance company? If so, I need to have that number around. I need to have that number in my phone. I need to make sure my people have that number. So, um, again, like I said, emergency care is going to be different. And if you are somebody who has a medical situation that might require emergency medical visits, that's something that you need to figure into your research because that's going to be, something that you will need to encounter. And it's better to ask lots of questions on the front end instead of making assumptions about a system that does not work the same way. Um, do y'all have any questions? Because I wanted to talk a little bit. I could give y'all some specifics about cost here. When I lived in Honduras, I did not engage in the medical system because I was living in a country, I was living in a city specifically that did not have the greatest resources. And I don't have medical conditions that necessitated that I interact with the system. Um, but it was so I don't have any personal, well, I take that back. I do have some personal stories about when I went to the dentist in Honduras. In Kuwait, um, that was probably the most sort of bureaucratic system because again, like I was not feeling well. I went to the doctor. I went to a doctor that my insurance said I should go to or what have you, because it's a country in the Middle East, English was widely spoken. So there wasn't a language barrier the way I dealt with a language barrier when I lived in Honduras, because there were not a lot of English speaking medical folks and my Spanish was trash. um, but uh, and this had more to do with the people I was working for. I had to like get, in the US, you go to the doctor, in most places, I think, you go to the doctor writes you a note to prove like this person came to visit, this is when they can return to work, that sort of thing. When I lived in Kuwait, the doctor's note was not good enough for my employer. I had to get my note signed by somebody at like the Ministry of Medicine. It was completely ridiculous. And I did not enjoy dealing with that kind of bureaucracy and whatnot. Um, and when I lived in China, when you get your visa, your work visa to go to China, you have to do a medical exam. I had to do this when I moved to Kuwait as well, because folks don't want sick immigrants coming to their country. Um, and then when you got to China, you had to go to a specific hospital and complete the medical checkup. And admittedly, this was not a private hospital, but I was not comfortable with the level of sanitation at this medical facility. So I tried my best to avoid interacting with the system unless it was through the private system. I've had more experience here in Mexico because I've spent more of my time in Mexico. Um, it's good to know the emergency numbers in your new country and countries before you go. That is true, but um, I do you, something to think about. Like, I don't know that I will be calling the emergency response number here in Mexico, because I don't know that my Spanish is strong enough, and I don't know that anybody at 911 speaks English. That's not an assumption I'm willing to make. Um, so yes, have the number, but also might if you don't speak the local language, you might also want to have somebody who can call the number for you and convey the nature of the emergency. Um, okay, good piece of advice here. If you have a chronic or autoimmune condition, definitely connect with an insurance broker before you move to get what your options are. Um, if you have pre-existing conditions, that can make it very tricky when you're trying to get insurance coverage. It was in Central America and here in Mexico. This was the first time I'd ever been hit with, like, when I got my medical insurance, they had a waiting period before they would cover certain situations. Like, if and I don't think this is the case in the US, but let's say I had been pregnant when I started working. Their insurance would not have covered that pregnancy because it was a pre-existing condition. If you wanted them to cover your pregnancy, you had to be insured for at least a year before they would cover it. And I've seen similar clauses when it comes to things like cancer and diabetes and things like that. So, um, something to think about. Can you tell us about Well Women's Care, specifically for perimenopause and HRT treatment in Mexico City? Asking for my future self. I can answer a little bit of this, but I'm in the mix right now. I will tell you that you can have all the doctors you want. There is a website, an app called Dr. Alia, where you can look up doctors for the specialty you need. And you can find out, like, when are they in the office? What do they charge for visits? What do they charge for video, phone consults, all of that kind of stuff. Um, a lot, and on that app, you can also see what languages they speak. What I did, because I needed to go have a well woman visit, what I did on Instagram, the minute you click on one thing, all of a sudden they start serving you ads. And so I got an ad for basically um, what month? It was a month associated with women, so it might have been like Women's History Month or something like that. But I clicked on this one ad, and all of a sudden they start serving me all these other doctor's office and clinics that were had their like package where they would include, a pap smear, a transvaginal ultrasound, all this stuff for the price. And so what I would do I would then text those places and I would ask, like, do you have doctors that speak English? Not that that would completely rule, if they didn't have an English speaking doctor, that would completely rule out me going, but at least I would know ahead of time whether or not they did. And so I went kind of the clinic route as opposed to picking OBGYN because really what I wanted was a gynecologist and not the obstetrician part, but I struggled to find people who didn't do both. Um, and, one, that was probably the most thorough well woman visit I have ever had. Um, and I think it cost me 1,500 pesos. So at the time, it was about $75. Um, Now there are, and I'm in the process of this, I need to make an appointment with a doctor who to talk to her about HRT. Um, and so to answer your question, it's fairly easy. Like if that's what you want, you can reach out to doctors and just straight up ask, do you do this? Can I come and talk to you about this? How much does it cost? I will also add that when I went to my well woman visit, she was like, also, you need to get a mammogram. And I forgot the other thing she told me I needed to do. Okay. Her office did not do mammograms, but she wrote a little paper that said I needed a mammogram. I didn't really even need that paper. I There are tons of clinics that are like specifically women's clinics, but there are also lab companies. There's a series of them that are available. And so I went on the El Chopo website. I looked up mammogram. They were like, we only do this at certain locations. I booked my appointment completely online at the location that was close to me that did them. And I think my mammogram was the equivalent of $22. And they sent me the images, but she was like, if you want to print them out, that would have cost me 75 cents or something like that. Um, Okay, here we've got somebody with some experience, HRT in Mexico City, pretty easily, gynecologist and endocrinologist. I think the biggest difference for those of us coming from the US is you don't have to ask anybody permission. If you've decided that this is a kind of care you need, you find a doctor and they provide it. It's not like you've got to go back and forth and convince them. At least that's been my experience. Um, you're saying, "This is what I want, this is what I need." They will tell you the test, they may order or offer those tests, but I feel very much like you are in the driver's seat, and that's a very different experience than I had with medical care in the US. Um, Something that was so we've talked about kinda like preventative stuff, something circling back to emergency care. Um Particularly, like cost. A friend of mine recently had to have surgery and they did not have insurance. And so for those that are very concerned about cost, I can give you cost here in Mexico City. But I think it is very similar other places. And again, for those of you in the US, use what you know it would cost in the US kinda as your comparison. So a friend of a friend, I think tore their ACL and had to go to the hospital, had to have surgery. Um, Now, here's a big difference. When you are paying out of pocket for, hospitalizations, unlike in the US where, they have you fill out your insurance paperwork. If you don't have insurance paperwork, you sort the money out at the end. That is not the case here. And I would imagine, I know I've heard stories similar in like Asia and Thailand, in Vietnam. So when they went to the hospital and they knew they weren't sure how long they were gonna have to be there, but they knew there was going to, certain things were they had to put a down payment up front of I think 80,000 pesos, which should be like $4,000. They had to pay that up front, and that, whatever costs they incurred while they were in the hospital would be deducted away from that. That money had to be paid upfront. Now, if you're in some little small town, they may want cash. This person was going at a hospital here in Mexico City. It was a private hospital. They accepted credit card. And then, um, you know, determined they were going to have surgery. The surgeon then was like, okay, this is what surgery will cost. Um, and they got that number up front, and as they were getting prepped to go into surgery, the payment people showed up and was like, hey, wait, before y'all take them to the operating room, we got to get the money for the surgery. And all told, I think 3 days in the hospital, surgery, anesthesiology, uh, I would imagine some medications while in the hospital. I think the price came to about 160,000 pesos, which is like $8,000. I don't know. Anybody had ACL surgery in the or no, it wasn't ACL. I think it was the Achilles. It was one of them. I did not do well in anatomy and physiology, but they had to have surgery, and basically it had to be paid upfront. Any fees that weren't covered by the deposit, before you check out of the hospital, the bill has to be handled. So that is something else to understand about going abroad and getting medical care. It often takes US Americans by surprise. And because in the US, we have this whole system of like credit and credit reports and all of that. They don't have that here. So their best time to get their money is while you are physically there. They will not be billing you later down the road. Um, at least in a country like Mexico. If you're in a country that has blanket universal health care, um, it is possible that you will go ahead, be seen, be treated, and receive a bill later. And that bill is going to be significantly less than what would be in the United States, because y'all have heard the stories. Um, I'm trying to think, is there anything else in my notes that I want to make sure I shared with y'all? I will also mention a couple of things. Um, for the folks that are in, let me see if this is Mexico specific or is this Latin American specific. I think, okay, this is Spanish specific. I am going to drop a link in the chat for a medical, what is this? A medical translator app. Like, I have Spanish, but I don't have medical Spanish. When I went to the doctor, you know, I was told the doctor spoke English. The doctor I saw, she probably took English class at some point, but she did not speak English. And so we were both there with our Google Translate, because of the things that I couldn't understand in Spanish. But I'm going to drop a link to a medical translator app that is specifically for like going to the doctor and that sort of thing. Let me type this. And I'll put this in the description of the video as well. $8,000. Yeah, shoot, my deductible was almost 2,500, and I worked for an insurance company. Yeah, and this is why I want us to be like careful when we talk about cost and affordability. For somebody who is earning dollars, $8,000, although nobody wants to be surprised by an $8,000 bill, but like that is doable if you can, like, if you can put it on credit card and, like, make your monthly payments, that's very doable to me. But I thought about when they were going through this, I thought about, what if you're somebody here who earns minimum wage, which is about like 12, $13 a day? $8,000, that nobody has that just lying around. So, and unlike this person who went to a private hospital and had a private room, and the hospital provided meals and that sort of thing, somebody who's making minimum wage or below here would be looking at the public system. And in the public system here, your family, your people are expected to provide sheets. They're expected to feed you. That, of course, brings the cost down. So, that's something I think specific to like Mexico and Central America. When I've talked to people about the public system in most Western European um, countries, it's not, the system provides a little bit more for you than it does here. And I think that's something to remember when you are trying to decide if a country is the right place for you, and if healthcare is at the top of your list. Do your due diligence and make sure you understand those various levels of service and exactly what they provide. I've shared on this channel before that my original plan when I retired early was, after I got my residency in Mexico, I was going to buy into the public healthcare system. Foreigners can buy into it, like, if you don't work for a company here that pays into it for you, foreigner could buy into it, and it's a varying amount depending on your age and that sort of thing. But it would have been like $400 a year for medical care. I was like, great, what a deal. But I was here at the height of the pandemic, and I watched the public system crumble. So I had to go back to the drawing board. And that's when I made the decision to get private insurance, because I did not, this was my mistake. I did not fully understand how the public system worked. And at the time, my Spanish definitely was not good enough for me to navigate the public system. I don't know that it is now, but that is something that you need to consider. So I think that's kind of the big thing I want folks to leave with tonight, is that don't just ask, what is healthcare like there? Think very specifically about, what are your healthcare needs, possible emergencies. What are your preventative things? Are there elective things that you are interested in? And how does that work? How does that system work? What are the differences between the system that you are used to and the system that exists in this new country? Can you live with those differences? Like I mentioned to y'all, Mexico City only has 45 uh, city ambulances. For a lot of people, that is not something that they can live with. And so that would eliminate this place as an option for them. That is, though, that's a question that you've got to ask yourself. So that's absolutely the number one thing I want you to leave here with tonight. And something to, I've talked about this a little bit more, a little bit previously, and I think I might do a video kind of give some specifics about it. Is that, like, there are some things that you might want to kind of sort of self-insure yourself for. Like a butler to here talking about putting away money specifically for emergencies and things like that, particularly if you're in a situation where you are hard to insure. And that's an issue people run into as they age. this is kind of everywhere, but it's particularly an issue when you are aging abroad. There becomes a point where they will still sell you health insurance, but it is going to be so cost prohibitive that it might be beneficial to sort of self-insure, that you set aside a specific amount of money that, you have like in a high yield savings account, so that if you do have to be hospitalized or that sort of thing, you have the cash to be able to pay. And it's not, a situation where they won't admit you because you don't have the money. I may talk about that in a little depth later on. We'll make one more call for questions. I wanted to talk about this. I see expats recommending safety wing travel insurance. I may even have an affiliate link under this video for safety wing. I would say with safety wing, it's a very easy it's a very easy lift. You are already traveling and you decide that you need insurance. Safety Wing is one of the few countries that will insure you even though you've already started on your trip. It's their real sweet spot is kind of like Nomad insurance, people who are not living in a single location, people that are spending time in different places around the world. I would advise, if you are considering Safety Wing, to look very specifically at the amounts of coverage offered for someone your age and ask yourself, are you comfortable with those numbers? As with all insurance policies, the best prices go to the young and the healthy. Um, so that's what I will say about Safety Wing, is to look at those numbers and ask yourself, are you comfortable with those numbers? Are you comfortable with the restrictions that they have? And if you are, it could be a great solution. You might also consider using something like that as a sort of like an add on top of an existing policy. Yeah. Sometimes they won't even sell you a policy at any cost. Yeah, because y'all, we got to remember, insurance companies are in the business of making money. If you seem like somebody who might actually need to use their service, you could be, it's going to be hard for them to make money off of you. And so they may opt to be like, nah, it's not worth it. You're too big of a risk, and they won't sell you a policy. But um, I don't, like I don't necessarily recommend self-insuring in the US because costs can be so exorbitant. But outside the US, where pricing is far more transparent. It is far more affordable. It is absolutely doable. You can also do something similar when it comes to like long-term care, because I health insurance companies are very suspect in my book. But who's even more suspect than them are long-term care insurance companies. I just do not have faith that those people are going to honor the policies that they sold. And so if you are, abroad and you are planning to age abroad, building into your budget, setting aside money that goes in a high yield savings account for, you start doing this early, not like when you need it. But if you're in your 50s now, this is a great time. If you're in your 40s, even better. But to start putting aside some money that can be used to pay for that care that you need. um yeah. Okay. So not just not just Latin America, not just Asia. In Kenya, some hospitals require family to provide meals, and they'll keep you there until the bill is paid. So Again, I don't mention these things to be deterrents, but it's more of you need to understand the lay of the land in this new place you're considering and not just work off assumptions that it works like it did back home because, it really doesn't. Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, we will wrap this up and I will talk to y'all next week. I hope that everyone has been having a good June so far. We're 3 days in. I hope it's been fabulous for you. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I'm supposed to tell y'all. Nothing is coming to mind. So I will see y'all again next Tuesday. Not 100% sure about the time, but thank you to everybody who came and hung out with me live. Again, if you are watching this in the future and you've got questions, drop them in the comments. We will try to see if we can get you an answer.